auction for your ambitious plan. Now we have the last but not least speaker, David Nelson, Executive Director of Climate Policy Initiative. Please, David. And let me remind you that with the Identify app, you can join the app and select question and answer for the speakers. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. And thanks all the speakers beforehand. My job here today, hopefully if the slides work, is to add just a little bit more to what I think a number of the speakers have talked about, and then try to pull it all together and see what this actually means for what market design might look like coming in the future. And the good news is it's not so far away from where we have. Some key messages, some key insights. First of all, the economics of electricity markets are really changing. I'll go through that very quickly. And they're not just changing in lower costs, they're changing in what is the components of costs. We need to develop incentives around different sources of flexibility. And all of this, the cost of finance is so important, and we never should forget that, because market design is mostly about trying to keep the appropriate investors and the appropriate cost of finance in place. The current approaches to electricity market design solve some of the problems, but actually they create a lot of others. And so the idea is to get them to solve the problems that we need to solve and segregate it in a way that solves those problems that need to be solved without creating the issues. And as I said, I'll put a low-cost way forward. Some work we did a couple of years ago, this is a little dated, we wanted to start from a blank sheet of paper and say, well, what would happen if you started and you built an electricity grid from scratch? You could either build it with technologies that were infinitely scalable, so we ignored all the hydro and such you had. We actually ignored the demand management in this. What would the cost be if you built it with only CCGTs, or you built it with a combination of renewable energy and some gas to provide backup? It turns out with today's costs, the cost of renewable energy system is just about the same price. And in fact, at the same price at $50 a ton carbon tax. By 2030, with the reductions of costs, we see that a system built entirely out of renewable energy will be cheaper than one built out of cost, even when you include a gas, even when you include the flexibility costs. Now, if you pull back in the value of existing power plants to use as flexible sources, hydro, and demand manage it, we think that flexibility cost will actually be lower. So this number that shows $70 a megawatt hour would actually get to 50 to 55, depending on the market. The key here is that flexibility is now almost half of the cost here. When we talk about flexibility, what we need to think about is not just day-night balancing, but there's a whole series you need to think about, from the 1-minute balancing to the daily ramping to seasonal balancing. It turns out that any clean energy source increases the amount of flexibility you need. Nuclear, because it is the high capital cost, means that it is less economically flexible, and renewables across the spectrum. There are a whole range of flexibility options. I won't go through these. I think they've been discussed earlier. But they fall on from the supply side to the demand side to conversion to other forms of energy, so making heat when there's energy available, direct electricity storage, and infrastructure. The key is, for each one of these flexibility options that we just talked about, can we find out which are the winning technologies here? We've done some work where we looked across all of the flexibility needs, not just the 5 we had out there, but there's many variations in between, and the technologies. And here is a ranking order of those costs. The dark blue represents those resources that we think are the lowest cost scalable resource at that time. So anything that's in red are ways that you save money. The one in blue is what would be the default backup technology for this flexibility need, and the one in the gray are out of the money. But what's important, if you look at the evolution towards 2030 costs, what you find is that the technologies change and the costs get lower. So we have to be thinking about this not just in terms of today's costs, but where we get those costs to. The key about integrating existing, for instance, CCGTs or hydro to lower the costs, This proves that point, showing it for an example in California, where we took the existing hydro and saw how it reduced the overall flexibility cost in California by about half. Again, I'll actually skip this in the interest of time because I want to get to the future market. But what this does show is that for each of the different flexibility needs, the technologies change that are the default technologies and those technologies that are low cost over time. In particular, you might look down at the lithium-ion batteries, which today are out of the money in creating short-term reserves or daily ramping in particular. But in 20 years, 15 years, they will definitely be in the money. So the next point to talk about is, let's go back to the current designs, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding or a lot of arguments that we find going on about how markets should work. The typical market design that we talk about now, you basically stack up all the power plants by costs, you create a demand curve. What you then do is the price effectively in any day is determined by what is the marginal power plant that is needed at that point. It's a bit more complicated but I just want to simplify it for this point. The issue then is that you'll get an hourly price a price that varies across the day depending on what is the marginal price. It can be very low, can even be negative overnight, and it will peak when demand is higher. That's all well and good when you are dispatching a plant that has fuel price risk or that you can actually plan to turn on and off. But if you actually have a wind turbine, what you've done is, should you be giving somebody an incentive to have the wind blow at 5 o'clock in 2026 when they've made the investment decision in 2016? You're actually imposing a risk upon renewable providers that they needn't have. And this is part where the auctions really help. But what we find from investors is they look at the wholesale market price and they look at the difference between the auction price and the wholesale market price as being an effective subsidy, and they view that subsidy as it increases as being a risk. And let's look at what happens when we go to a market where you have a lot of renewable energy in the system, 70, 80%. Well, you'll actually get, since there's zero variable cost of any of the renewable energy, you get a merit order, a stack like that on the left. It will be flat, zero most of the days. It will even be negative as you need incentives to start some generation plant to have it online for the peak. And then you'll have a single peak that might happen for 1 hour or something of that nature. You will have costs that no longer are providing incentives. So with zero and negative average wholesale prices, which we already see renewable energy reducing wholesale prices, not because energy costs are going, but because there's a lot of zero and negative price hours, this perception of what is the subsidy for renewable energy increases. In fact, we've got a crazy situation with existing markets where the cheaper renewable energy gets, the more renewable energy you build, the lower wholesale prices go, and the higher the implicit subsidy and therefore risk around renewable energy. The market is completely broken when you're going to an hourly market. To further put this argument, and this is some stuff we did in Germany a couple of years ago when we were looking at the EU directives and helping the German government on this. We looked, there is an orthodoxy in the market that there's economic value in curtailing renewable energy. And of course there is, if that incentive is given when you're making the final investment decision. If you know exactly how much you're going to be curtailed or what the limit of that curtail. But if you don't know, you impose a very significant risk. On the left, we modeled what would happen if you did not increase flexibility in Germany with the hours of curtailment. And you have to think as an investor about both the P50 case, that's a 50-50 probability, that'll be a lower or higher, and the P90 case, that's the case that you assume will happen 10% of the time. Because debt investors don't get the upside, they have to look at the P90 case. So what happens as curtailment goes up, they will reduce the amount of debt in the project, and therefore the cost of capital goes up. And in fact, our modeling at the time showed that because of the kind effects of increased renewable curtailment and uncertainty in the debt markets, the cost would go up by more than 50% because of the financial risk imposed by curtailment if it was not seen in advance. So the key is you need to have that decision when final investment decisions made so they can invest on that. So what do we need to do? And we're proposing a two-market design, one where we separate the fixed energy supply and yet put in the delivery of flexibility. Because those hourly markets, what they do is they create incredible incentives around delivering flexibility, particularly if they're not watered down by recovering some of your money from generation. So to keep finances low on the infrastructure part, the renewable energy, you need to match the risks to the time frame when decisions are made. That is very much the auctions that we saw in the Mexico case, where you know exactly what the relative price is, and that is what you're going to get at the beginning. You need to also be matching the risk profile to the appropriate investors. Actually, for renewable energy, it isn't utilities that should be investing in it. They're too expensive. Their cost of capital is too high. They have equity owners when these are actually, if you have a good auction, become basically debt instruments. It looks exactly like a debt instrument. You've got a large upfront capital payment, very low operating costs that you can manage out with operation and maintenance contracts. It should be actually planned that way. And so that's our energy market. On the second part, we have a delivery market, which is very much along the lines of the most sophisticated markets we have in places like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland, which are hourly or sub-hourly prices based on marginal with locational incentives. So every node on the network has its own price so that you can actually take advantage of flexibility to meet distribution and transmission needs. And there are examples of this. So we had the Mexico example about the auctions. I have here the Brazil example. It needs to be a wholesale market built around annual biannual contracts where those, and the important thing here is that should become the effective wholesale market price. When we're quoting the electricity price, we shouldn't be quoting the sum of 8,760 hours of annual prices. We should be saying, well, what is the price of buying a kilowatt hour in an energy market? And this is just an aside. Once you have that market in place, what we have found is that there are different types of financial vehicles, not utility-owned, that particularly tie the cash flows from these to institutional investors. And our analysis shows that that would reduce the cost of capital, or the cost per kilowatt hour, by about 20%. So you get these markets in place, and then we change the structure of the industry. On the other side, you have a delivery market, which does look a lot more like where we're going to some of the markets. Now, the key here is that the energy kilowatt hour cost is a pass-through. Then what you do is you charge customers for the incremental cost of buying or of having that energy delivered at a particular time. Clearly, if you have rooftop solar, you don't have to pay a cost, but you'll be paying for the balancing cost, and it may be an export cost that you have. We have modeled this. Prices do vary strongly from various, so you might be buying your energy at $50 or $40 a megawatt hour, but the cost of delivery could be between negative $600 to positive $3,000 a megawatt hour. So we've also seen that what happens with coal plants is they can change from operating at 80% load factor to operating at 20% load factor, but be almost as profitable because you're paying them for the flexibility that they deliver. So how does this work? Well, you have a consumer, buys a long-term energy contract or builds his own. He can then either go directly to the delivery market operator and pay the delivery charge that would happen at that particular hour, or he can go to an aggregator. And the key is these aggregators would be able to themselves invest in storage capacity, or they might be able to go into your property and say, this is 5 different ways we can tune, and if you give us control over your electric battery charging or your appliances, or we might even invest in demand-side management, insulation in your house. If you do all these things, we will offer you tariff X. If you do half of them, we'll offer you tariff Y. This will give the aggregators the ability to actually access, and as we're showing here, you can access your own supplies. Your flexible hydro would be in here. A lot of the flexible generation, so a lot of the GTs and CCGTs would actually choose, because it's more economic for them to participate in this market rather than in the main market. And so that provides the basic bones of the overall of an overall plan going forward. And the good news, as I run out of time, is that we're partway there. We've got all of the components. You know, we've done various pieces of this in different markets, but it is now making this the orthodoxy so that we can get on with the task of reorganizing our industries, of investing in technology development, and just reshaping our industry so that these defaults are what investors are investing in. And when you do that, we think that there's a 20% cost advantage to be had in the financing of the clean energy, and another 20% cost advantage to be had in the long-term cost of flexibility. There is a tremendous amount to be had there, and we just have to make sure that we move in this path.
Thank you very much. And we have 10 minutes for some questions. I have received some of them. I would like to start with Donna. Donna, you mentioned the different misalignment, the three main misalignment. But what are the main barriers for realizing the suggested changes? And the question is particular for retail, but of course it's up to you to articulate. And while you answer this question, I would like to ask two other questions for the other panelists so they can think about it. The first is, do you believe locational pricing in short-term market will help in long-term generation investment in congested areas? And the second one is about capacity market. If there is an innovation in capacity market that could support the integration of variable renewables into the system. So I will ask the other speakers to comment on and get back on this question, while you, Donna, please answer the first question. Thank you.
So the value of correcting misalignment, especially in the retail market, is that, like we've said, there is emerging capability that is developing on the demand side, within the consumers. We are seeing electrification of either transport connecting new types of demand, but within that is also new potential for large resources for flexibility to be fed back into the grid. And then if we resolve the misalignment, which is the fact that consumers now do not have a window into what's happening in the power system, and therefore adjust their own consumption and generation or even storage accordingly, then we're missing out on the capability that they have. So we want to be inclusive and empower the localize the distributed actors so that they can make the best use of the capabilities that they already have.
Thank you, Donna. And what about the other sectors, the other two sectors? With this, any other thought on the other main action that you would prioritize, let's say?
So we have to look at the whole market design as an integrated way. I have presented them as three separate issues, but when we think about it, they're all connected actually, because wholesale market, I said that we should improve the provision, the procurement of flexibility, and that might come from the retail market. So therefore, we might be bridging the whole two markets and just remove the wall between wholesale and retail altogether. And then secondly, as for network regulation, I said the main momentum impetus is to increase the locational awareness for generators and consumers. And then you should reflect that in the wholesale market and the retail market as well. So those issues, when we talk about them, we only present things in a linear way, so they seem quite distinct. But actually, the whole view is circular, which is very hard to capture in speech.
Absolutely. Thank you, Donna. If anybody want to answer, please, David, to the other two questions that I asked before.
So with respect to short-term locational marginal pricing models, it helps, but in and of itself, it is really, really, really expensive. If you think about an investor, think if I were, again, going to the debt investor, and I'm going to lend to a project that will have 1 hour that may or may not be at $3,000 a megawatt hour, do I lend money? No, right? I need some sort of certainty. Now, you get around that because aggregators will put together, and the idea is that an aggregator will put together various and be able to trade in the market and create some sort of predictability. But again, you're taking on so much risk that this requires a really high rate of return. And that leads you to your capacity markets. The issue around capacity markets is clearly that it's capacity markets for what, right? Having long-term capacity markets in place that might be locationally specific or for spinning reserve or any particular pieces help, but I think you have to think about clearly how this fits into the overall objectives and the needs that you have. Capacity markets for developing certain technologies may also be helpful, but the key is they're long-term markets. You know, going to the old and you know, I started in the UK with privatizing the UK electricity industry, and we had these debates in the 1980s, and the short-term capacity markets or value of lost load we have was a short-term solution. We knew that in the long term you wouldn't drive investment decisions unless you had this security of supply, and we haven't gotten any further. But I think a lot of the discussion about capacity markets misses the point of what we're trying to do. The second thing that you have when you think about capacity markets is that right now we have plenty of generation capacity, right? It's more about providing those individual flexibility services. And so let's focus on how we need to incentivize the lowest cost fixed and operating cost portions of those flexibility services rather than getting a generic solution that's going to create as many problems as it started.
Yeah, in fact, it's one of the hot points of debate, right? Ivan, I saw you were taking note. You may want to add, please.
Oh, no, I was actually learning from him.
There is one question on embedded network, Chris, and maybe this can be the last one because I myself promised the organizer to be in time at 12:30 for the lunch. Can neighboring embedded networks be linked to enable peer-to-peer transaction, and what is the role of utilities in this setup?
Yes, they can, and there's actually an example of that in Cornell, Sydney. They actually use the Sonnen battery to do peer-to-peer via blockchain. There's just an article about that. And they don't actually have to be physically linked. They're all linked to the network at large. And there's not a whole, I don't think there's a whole lot of reason to have peer-to-peer energy trading between the two embedded networks or many embedded networks because they play with the grid generally speaking. So they're tariff arbitraging and selling to the retail market, but also there's an ability for them to play at the wholesale market through FCAS and demand response. So peer-to-peer, there might be a market for that, but that's generally not what they're set up for. I think the one I referenced in Cornell is more of a pilot project. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. With this, we have to conclude the session. I would like to thank all of you for attending the session, and please join me in thanking the speakers for this interesting insight. A special thank from me to the team and to Javier who helped out to organize the session. Thank you. The lunch is served outside.